Good afternoon, friends. So welcome again to the STP training webinar, which is fine-tuning your Agile SDLC. Our speaker for the day is Melissa Tondi. I'm Smita Mishra, a professional tester myself, and I'm excited to host you all and Melissa on our STP webinars. Quick information for all of you. The next upcoming conference we have is Fall 2018 STPCon, which will be held at Arlington, Virginia from October 22nd to 25th this year. The keynotes and the workshops have been selected and sessions have been reviewed. Session review are also complete. The partial program is up for your review and registration at stpcon.com. So keep looking, more are to be added in the coming weeks. Another quick piece of information that I have for you is that there is an upcoming webinar connecting manual testers to the DevOps era by Dror Todres on 27th of June. Dror is the co-founder and CEO at Testcraft. The link is up for you to review and register. So go for it. And if you are on Twitter, please share the conference information and about this webinar with your followers, connections. You can also add STP's Twitter handle to your tweets, which is at SoftwareTestPro. You can also note down the speaker Twitter handle, which is for Melissa. It's at Melissa Tondi. And right before we start, a few housekeeping points for next 1 hour. All the attendees shall remain muted through the webinar. You can type in your questions and share them with us, and we shall take them up after Melissa is done with her presentation. If there is any specific question, which was very a pressing query that you have to ask on a particular slide, feel free to do that. We will interrupt Melissa and ask it for you. The webinar is recorded and it will be posted on SoftwareTestPro site for the attendees to go through later. All right, so let's get started with the webinar today. A very warm welcome, Melissa. We are very thrilled to have you with us today. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. Melissa Tondi has spent most of her career working within software testing teams. She's the founder of Denver Mobile and Quality, DMAC, board member of Software Quality Association of Denver, that is SQUAD, and director of quality engineering at Disrupt Testing, where she assists teams to continuously improve the pursuit of quality software, from design to delivery and everything in between. In her software test and quality engineering careers, Melissa has focused on building and organizing teams around three major tenets: efficiency, innovation, and culture, and has created the greatest common denominator, GCD approach, for determining ways in which team members can assess, implement, and report on day-to-day activities, so the gap between need and value is as small as possible. All right, Melissa, very warm welcome again, and the floor is all yours now.
All right.
Yeah, let me just share it.
Okay. Everything look good?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be a participant again in the STP community webinars. STP organization is a great organization. If you haven't already registered and signed up for the conference in the fall, do so. It's a great conference, and I'm really looking forward to participating once again in that conference. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about fine-tuning your Agile SDLC. And if you've heard anything or read anything that I've been speaking on over the last couple of years, I tend to focus on efficiencies and lately micro efficiencies. So, when we look at efficiencies across activities that we do, whether we're focusing on software testing, development, product management, Scrum Master, anything that kind of sits within the SDLC, it's somewhat easier to look at major areas that we can, kind of eliminate from our day or from our iterations. And recently, I've been kind of focusing on more micro efficiencies. So the activities that may take seconds or minutes, or in some cases, hours to do, but when you repeat those in a finite set of time, those quickly add up to sometimes hours, days, and in weeks. So it's been really interesting and fun for me to kind of deep dive into some company consulting engagements where we look at specific activities that are happening within our Agile SDLC and find ways to eliminate some of that waste and inefficiencies that happen on a day-to-day basis. So I'm excited to kind of share my thoughts on fine-tuning your Agile SDLC. So with that said, what are we going to talk about today? So we tend to see, I've certainly been in this intimately, where at the end of a sprint or at the end of a release, we always feel like there wasn't enough time to do something or multiple things. And there's a variety of reasons why it seems that we never have enough time, or why we have this nagging feeling that we wish we could have spent more time on activity A or B or C. We're also going to talk about what Agile activities and ceremonies we tend to emphasize. So for those of you who are practicing, some sort of Agile flavor, whether it's Kanban, Scrum, a variety of different hybrid methods within those, we tend to focus on the main ceremonies and activities that the Agile handbooks and coaches and consultants kind of discuss. And we'll talk a little bit about those and what we emphasize and why. And then we're going to deep dive into those and look at the inefficiencies and perhaps incorrect outcomes that tend to manifest themselves when we focus more time on ceremonies just for focusing on them for focusing sake, right? So we tend to kind of rotely go through some of those ceremonies, and by doing so, we tend to leave the actual value behind. So we're going to talk a little bit about the inefficiencies and sometimes incorrect outcomes that happen when we do that. And then, kind of the meat of this content is how do we fix them? And then I kind of offer a little bit of what we can do with that time saved. So the idea behind identifying and addressing inefficiencies and fine-tuning your SDLC is that there should be some time gained. And so instead of repeating activities that we may have already done, what we've done and what we've seen in the past is a pretty decent, significant time save that then we were able to add some more activities and services within our specifically testing team, but activities within our entire Agile project team, because we not only identified those inefficiencies and fine-tuned our overall SDLC, but we actually deliberately focused on activities that we either had no way of doing before because we ran out of time, or that we weren't able to enhance and move forward with. So we're going to talk about all 5 of these, and of course there'll be open Q&A at the end, as Smita had mentioned. So please queue up those questions, and if there is a question that you have that's related to a specific slide, Smita will certainly interrupt and we'll ask that question and make sure you have what you need. All right. So why is there never enough time? There's a variety of reasons, but these are kind of the top 4 that I've both witnessed, observed, and that people around the world have shared with me. Decreased schedules. So even with all the best laid plans of a great planning ceremony with the project team, there's always something that comes up that has somehow decreased our schedule. That could be because we have a client that's going live sooner than we'd thought. There is a big user conference or industry conference or go-to-market where we thought that we had Q4 to deliver, but now that's been pushed to Q3. We have inaccurate estimates. Sometimes, we go through and again, the best laid plans, and given the information that had been given to the team at that point, we estimate based off of all the information that was available to us. And of course, because software is software, and both in art and a science, sometimes those estimates, as we dive deeper in, become inaccurate. And generally what tends to happen is that we don't really go back and address and identify where those inaccurate estimates have been. So whereas we normally just say, okay, well, we may have pointed this story at a 5, but it actually was a 7 or an 11 or 9. we generally don't go back and actually deep dive and make sure that we're addressing those inaccurate estimates as they come in. And so what winds up happening in those situations is that we have lots of rollover. So it's pretty common that whereas we may have committed to, say, 50 points as a team over a 2-week sprint, that work actually was closer to 60 points or so. So how do we address that in the next sprint? Most of the time we address that by simply rolling over the rest of the 10 points. And then we have rollover after rollover after rollover from sprint to sprint. And then we get to the point where our last sprint is over, but we have so much rollover work and so much debt that was accrued based off of inaccurate estimates that we wind up having what we lovingly refer to as QA only or hardening sprints that wind up taking us weeks to recover from. A lot of times decisions are made in a silo. And by that, I mean, again, if after we've done our grooming and refinements and get to planning and we're actually within a sprint or before a sprint, we may have 1 or 2 people on a team making decisions based off of the user stories and the acceptance criteria in those user stories in a silo. And we don't have a good forum in which to bubble up that information so that that information becomes aware of and communicated widely out to the project team. Or in some situations, we may have an overly eager product manager and developer who are workshopping away and vetting out acceptance criteria, but there may not be a QA or tester sitting in that conversation. So those conversations are being had, and then decisions are being made. And again, we don't have that information widely available to the tester or to the rest of the team that may have responsibilities or dependencies on those decisions. And then, of course, risks are not vetted out appropriately or with enough weight. Risk-based planning and risk association is one of those not so necessarily exact sciences, because we, as the saying goes, we sometimes don't know what we don't know. And so as we're into the code or as we're testing that code, we may be uncovering risks, and we don't have a great forum in which to vet those risks out. So those are kind of the 4 areas that I've heard consistently over the last couple of years. And of course, the list goes on. You may have your own, and I'm certain you do, have your own reasons why there seems to never be enough time. So what I'd like to kind of go through today then is addressing those areas and figuring out, why do we seem to not have enough time? Which ways can we address? Where are we being inefficient or having incorrect outcomes? And let's address those so that we not only have enough time at the end of a sprint or when we're ready to release, but we've created a space where we can actually bring in more services that we previously didn't have time or the effort to be able to do in the past. So let's dive deeper into the Agile activities. So, these are this is not an exhaustive list, of course, but these again are kind of areas that we tend to get stuck on, or we have challenges either within the sprint days, at the end of the sprint, or throughout multiple sprints and through release. We emphasize our Agile ceremonies. Planning, refinement, or grooming, retros, demos, and of course stand-ups in there. So if you are currently practicing some flavor of Agile methodology or are familiar, most of these terms are probably very familiar to you. These are the things that we do almost daily, especially on stand-ups, but certainly that kind of tag along when we say that we're quote unquote doing Agile. So we tend to emphasize more dev completion versus a shippable thing. And I'll kind of talk a little bit later on why I prefer the term shippable versus dev complete, and why kind of just even changing that terminology has made such a huge difference when we talk about the definition of done, not only as it results with the project and what we're supposed to be delivering, but as it pertains to the practices or the pillars that are represented within the Agile team. And then, of course, we focus on and emphasize demos at the end of a sprint. Sometimes you may tag on those demos with the next planning or as a separate meeting at the end of the sprint. But the basis for that is that we tend to focus demos at the very end of the sprint and or all at once, so that we are now kind of putting the product manager or owner or whoever's responsible in your organization for accepting work that's done within a sprint. We tend to do that at once, which of course, as you know, when you kind of lump all the work that has taken a team of 7+ people 10 or more days to complete, you can see that that's probably introducing not only inefficiencies but inaccuracies when it comes time for that person or that team to be actually accepting that work for completion. And then, of course, I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, but the stand-ups, right? And so if you've ever been in a stand-up, which I'm sure most of you have been, we tend to focus on the big 3 questions. What did you do? What do you plan to do? And any blockers? And I always kind of harp on this a little bit, that there has been a little bit of a trend and really funny memes that have kind of popped up over the last couple of years of people who are trying to get out of stand-ups or trying to make them as quick as possible. And those are funny, but when we get to the point where the stand-ups are seen as being just a nuisance or adding little to no value within the project team, then we know we need to address that. The purpose of the stand-up is way more important than I think that a lot of organizations have been emphasizing. So I want to talk a little bit about specifically fine-tuning those stand-ups. So when we start looking at the inefficiencies or the incorrect outcomes that happen during those Agile ceremonies, we can kind of look at now, what are some of the main areas and challenges that tend to pop up during these ceremonies. So in planning, you may have a situation where the entire team and perhaps stakeholders, so people who are not necessarily part of the team but may be interested in hearing or seeing what the team is planning on committing to, and all of a sudden they are an active participant in planning meetings. So what should be taking an hour to an hour and a half of time every 2 weeks or whatever the cadence of your sprints are, when we have the entire team plus stakeholders and people who aren't actually doing the work on the day-to-day basis, those meetings can tend to take on a life of their own. So if you have an overeager vice president or C-level person coming in and asking questions, that hour and a half time span may actually increase to a couple hours. I've even heard of some companies who are still holding to half a day to full day type of planning ceremonies, because those planning meetings are so large and have so many attendees that are asking questions and not really being facilitated well. So talk a little bit about that. Refinement, and we kind of use refinement and grooming in some ways synonymously. So for this purpose, I'll kind of just use the term refinement and grooming synonymously. But if your organization has a distinction between the two, you can kind of get the gist of here. But again, we kind of talk a little bit about the whole team, and sometimes stakeholders are attending those as well. That can be an extremely inefficient use of time, because if you think about the outcome of what a refinement or a grooming session should have, the outcome is that everyone that has responsibility to do some work or all work on a particular story should have everything that they need to begin work. Otherwise, that story or piece of work should not necessarily be considered refined. And then when you move down the line within your SDLC, if a story is not fully refined by everyone who is working on it, then it should not be a candidate to be planned for and therefore committed in an upcoming sprint. So we tend to, because the way that teams are generally staffed is that we have one, possibly 2 product managers or owners, and then several developers, several testers, a scrum master, and some other kind of variety of other team players in there. But when we have an entire project team that's sitting in those refinements, those meetings can be very intense and heavy. And unfortunately, the outcome of refinement tends to get lost in the dust. And people who may not be comfortable speaking in a larger group, or who may be overshadowed because time is ticking away. When you have those larger meetings with many people in them, we can already see the inefficiencies that are happening. So, and we tend to focus on, kind of the one and done effect, which applies to both the refinements and the demos. But what I mean by the one and done effect is that we tend to have one refinement and expect that all of the information that the dev, the tester, and anyone else that has responsibility on there, that all of that information is going to be vetted out, understood, and able to be worked on within a huge meeting. So we want to try and avoid those one and done effects and move more into a more iterative refinement, or at least a 2 to 3 tiered approach refinement. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little while. And of course the demos, right? And kind of talked a little bit about this earlier as well, but the one and done effect, right? And so we tend to have demos. I've seen where the teams have been creative, where one person from the team, whether it's a developer or a tester or a designer, that demos all of the work that has been done within that sprint to the rest of the team and sometimes stakeholders, but specifically for the person who is ultimately responsible for accepting that work as complete within that sprint. And it opens us up for changes, for questions that person may have. So anytime that we have a one and done effect in there, I want to really kind of push that and swing that to the left of the SDLC. And I'll talk a little bit about what has been successful in some organizations that I've been involved in, especially around refinement and demos. And of course, the stand-ups, right? The big three. What did you do yesterday? What do you plan to do? Any blockers? And of course, the emphasis has recently been getting the heck out of there. We kind of roll our eyes, we kind of begrudgingly stand up from our desk or call in or dial into a stand-up meeting. And most of the time, because we are so rotely concentrated on those big three questions, we really miss the value of what the stand-up outcome is supposed to be. And when you think about kind of summarizing what that outcome of a stand-up should be, number one, it's the one time during the day, and hopefully every day, or at least consistently throughout the week, that the team is getting together to make sure that everyone is on board with what the plan is happening. And so not only should that be used as a kind of course, the status to talk about the big three, but it really should be used to check the health of the sprint, to see if there are anything, not only blockers that a person is trying to individually remove, but to see if someone on the team has some expertise or skill set to be able to do that. But instead, we've tended to kind of brush through those questions to push through and get through the stand-up so that we can, quote unquote, get back to real work, right? And so we want to talk a little bit about how we can fine tune the stand-up so that they provide much more value than simply asking and answering the big three questions. And then, of course, injections. And injections really is just kind of that catch-all term that says, hey, in all of the planning and all the things that we believed was going to happen, given the information that we had at that time, almost daily there's something that presents itself that may impact our ability to complete what we said we were committing to within a sprint. So we always go back to what did the team commit to in that planning meeting, given that information, and then not only when something, not only if something injects itself. You may have, again, we see this a lot, a VP of engineering or a CEO or CTO walking over to somebody's desk, tapping them on the shoulder and saying, hey, I need you to take care of this high priority customer issue. And that person says, well, this is somebody that I report to, or the CEO of the company. I can't say no. And so, of course, they go and do that, which is absolutely correct in a lot of ways. but we don't wind up bringing that up to the forefront to see whether or not it is causing an impact to what we originally committed to, but more importantly, to see if the team can help fill in the gaps whether or not that work that was initially interrupted can get back on track. So we want to make sure that not only we're not trying to prevent injections, because again, this is software. Injections are going to happen in all various states and forms. But we want to make sure that we're embracing them, understanding that they happen, call it what it is, but more importantly, having a way and a forum in which to bubble those injections up to make sure that they ultimately will not impact our ability to complete what we originally committed to within a sprint. And then focusing on dev completion, right? And so when we say we're done or dev complete, that tends to be in a lot of ways, rightly or wrongly, we tend to say, okay, well, that last line of code is written for this user story, so we're probably in the clear. And we tend to emphasize the dev completion as being the most important part of being complete with a user story or a series of user stories. But that gets us into the point where if we have particularly buggy code, and for those of you who are testers, we know that this happens lots of times. We may get a user story that dev has completed, and it may be breaking the build, or we may be finding severity 1 bugs within moments of us first testing it, right? And so we're focusing a lot of times on the last line of code or the code being complete versus all of the things that need to happen to get this into the hands of our users, which is why I have emphasized instead of saying dev complete or complete, we talk about being shippable. And I'll talk again a little bit about what that means, so that if that's a term or if that concept is something that you can bring back to your organization, give you some tips around what that means and how that's been successful for us. And of course, you know, the outcome or the impact of only focusing on dev complete leads us to QA or test only sprints, which means that if we are picking up the slack for one or more sprints after dev has been completed, and there are no other tasks that dev has been planned or refined to do within that sprint, they will likely move on to the next piece of work. And then what you're doing is you're putting days and sometimes weeks in between when that last line of code was written and checked in and being tested. And we're writing bugs against code that may have been complete weeks ago. So when you're looking at an inefficiency standpoint, a developer who has checked in code 1 to 2 days is going to be much more efficient when we're starting to find and write up bugs that they need to troubleshoot and fix. It's going to be much easier for that developer to look through code that is 1 to 2 days written versus weeks on end. So I kind of go through a rule of thumb where any time of more than 2 days within a sprint where test or QE and dev are not working together is generally a flag for us. And again, we'll talk a little bit about how we can kind of check the health of the sprint by retuning and fine-tuning some of those Agile ceremonies, specifically the stand-ups that we go through to make sure that we are watching some of these flags so that they don't become red flags and catastrophic. We can kind of keep them into more warning and caution and address those immediately as they come up. So, and I talk a little bit about this as well. We tend to QE test QA. We tend to be an enabler, or what I like to call the martyr with schedule or scope creep. My first direction is to give it up. And being that team or that person on the team that stays until the last day of the sprint and works all hours through the evening to complete the sprint. It is what makes us awesome. I mean, none of us likes to see something fail, especially something that may be attributed to our work or something that we are putting our stamp of approval on or eventually releasing to customers. So we do almost everything in our power, and sometimes out of our power, to keep the sprint afloat or to make sure that those last few stories that should have been coming our way days ago but happen to not be complete until the last day of the sprint, that we just kind of buck it up and we do whatever it takes to complete the sprint on time. When we're looking across the room or in the office at a 6 p.m. on a Friday or the last day of the sprint, and we're the only ones there trying to complete the sprint feverishly. So that's what that characteristic is what generally makes us awesome, but it also lets bad or impactful behaviors continue to be acceptable, right? I think, and I speak from absolute personal experience, I'm one of the laziest people that I know, because that also makes me be much more efficient with my time. But if someone is going to continue to offer to do something for me that I should have been doing on my own, human nature is I'm going to let them do that, especially if it's something that I don't generally like to do, like test my own work, or maybe write unit tests, or have a code review, or anything that are our own individual personal quality checks. If there is a team that is, again, rightfully or wrongfully set up to check those, I'm going to let them do that, because human nature tells me I only want to work on the things that are fun for me. So when we continue to be the martyr or the enabler within our project teams, that sometimes lets those bad behaviors or those quality checks that should have been happening from that individual slip, and we are then therefore taking on not only the responsibility that we have as testers or QA on our project team, but we're also taking up responsibility from other individuals who may not be emphasizing that. The key here is that for Agile methods to work efficiently, all team member work needs to be accounted for, and it should be evenly distributed across each day of the sprint, right? And so I've used this term a while, but when you start looking at we generally say anywhere from 60 to 80 hours of time is generally contributed to a sprint. So that makes up anywhere from a 6 to an 8-hour day out of a 10-day sprint. So you can kind of do the math there. So if you have 80 hours of work that is associated with a 10-day sprint, we have to make sure that we're paying attention to that being consistent across each day. We can't make up 80 hours of work in the last 1 to 2 days of the sprint. And so kind of the funny story I use to that is that, it usually takes about 9 months to make a human baby, but you can't just simply add 9 women for 1 month and automatically have a baby from just because we added 9 women in there to kind of kick that. So I want to kind of use that as a little bit of a guide that we should be looking how work is evenly distributed across each day of the sprint, and make sure that as we start looking at our health checks within the sprint, and by using fine-tuning our stand-ups, we want to make sure that we're not being caught in the situation where all of the work for the sprint is going to be put on test or QA's plate the last 2 days of the sprint. So keep those 6 to 8 hours per day, make sure that that work is coming evenly, and I'll talk a little bit about where we've seen success with that. And of course the demos, right? The one and done effect. Usually it's at the end of the sprint and in a big crowd, but how many times has something been found in a demo that needs to be fixed? And I've seen this lots of times where, we have somebody who's demoing functionality and very proud of the work, which they should be, at the end of the sprint, and the entire team believes that that work is complete and is going through the formality of acceptance. But then we have that person who is responsible for accepting that work start asking questions, and then at the end of that demo, it has to go back to the team and says, actually this didn't meet my expectations. I was expecting it to work this way, or I was expecting the flow to behave like this, or the design to look like this. So when we again focus on one demo or one and done effect for some of the other activities within our SDLC, we leave it open to a lot of inefficiencies, especially when the team believes that they're done with the work, and that's a candidate for being accepting. So when we keep those demos at the end of the sprint, we're opening ourselves up for a little bit more work, not only if, but when we'll have to kick back that work because it didn't meet the acceptance criteria from the product owner, or again, whoever is playing that role within your organization. We see misunderstood or ambiguous acceptance criteria. we have one-sided refinements, and a lot of times, it's generally with dev and product. We've gone through lots of times where, and I've certainly seen this, where again you kind of may have a developer and the product manager or product owner huddled, in somebody's in a room or huddled across somebody's desk, and you know that they're talking about a user story or perhaps a couple of user stories, and they're putting more and more refinement on that user story just with the two of them, which of course then becomes one-sided refinement, which means that if that information is not bubbling up to the tester or UX or whoever is designing that work, you're going to have lots of ambiguous and mostly misunderstood acceptance criteria. So we're going to test it differently than perhaps what the outcome of these one-sided refinements wound up happening. So we want to try and avoid that, or not necessarily to dissuade collaboration between the team, but when those conversations tend to happen, we want to make sure that the team understands that they can have those conversations. We want them to bring in the third pillar, in this case, perhaps QA or UX, when those conversations are happening. But if that can't be avoided, we want to make sure that we're embracing the fact that these conversations and smaller kind of collaborative working sessions happen, but we also want to make sure that they're honoring the more collaboration across the team, and that information is being communicated out appropriately to those who have responsibility on those user stories. And then we have anchored sizing. And this is an interesting one. I don't know if this term actually exists in the industry. I've kind of put it in here because it makes a lot of sense to what I was observing in the last few companies that I've worked with or consulted with. And so we get to the point where we're in a refinement or a grooming session, or wherever the session is that you size the work, whether you're using t-shirt sizes, the Fibonacci series, or some other manner of sizing. But we tend to get to that point where, again, we tend to rush them, especially if we have an entire team in those meetings. We want to try and keep the meeting flowing and on time. And we tend to read the user story, and somebody says, okay, does anyone have any questions? In some cases that may be the first time that a team member is seeing what that user story needs to be doing, and then next thing you know, they're expected to size that. And so if you don't have that the right information, or not even enough time to be able to distill what the user story is, the ultimate outcome is, we tend to defer to the person who has the most information. And in some cases that could be the dev lead or a test lead or somewhere, a senior developer or something like that. And so what I've seen lots of times in these sizing meetings, again, either refinements or groomings or whatever meeting that your sizing happens, somebody will count down and say, okay, we're ready to size this. And they count down 3, 2, 1, and everybody's head turns to that one person that they know has the most information. And they may hold up 3 fingers and say, I think it's a 3. And if no one else has as much information, they will tend to defer to the person that has the most information, which of course is putting everyone else that has responsibility on that story in a very awkward position. So they don't have enough information to argue against that or to offer a different sizing. So they ultimately defer to that person, assuming that they have the most information, but we never wind up making sure that we have that information that that team member had previously, and making sure that information is captured somewhere, or that there's a discussion happening with the rest of the team responsible with that story. So we want to avoid anchored sizing. And there are a couple of tools out there that we've used pretty successfully. There are a couple of kind of random or anonymous type of sizing things where you take the holding up the fingers or somebody saying a number, because no one can see what anyone else's sizing is until all of the results come in. And so we want to try and remove that anchored sizing, but really we want to try and fix the fact that if someone consistently has more information on the project team and is able to size as accurately as he or she believes that story is, and no one else can, we know that we need to button up more what's happening in the refinement and grooming, and eliminate or at least decrease those one-sided refinements. And then, we kind of go through duplicating testing efforts. And I've talked about this in a couple of talks that I've had as well. We tend, and we as in QE or QA, we assume that in a lot of cases, that no testing is happening. And that's because we don't really have a lot of insight into what is happening within each of our disciplines. We don't really know exactly what UX or design is doing from their own quality checks. Sometimes we don't know what our developer counterparts are doing as their individual checks. And so because we don't have insight, or because we may not be asking, or because our other teammates are not sharing that willingly with us, we assume that no testing is happening. And so what winds up happening is that we are duplicating testing efforts. So we want to avoid that, and we want to make sure that the moment that we get a story to test, that we are emphasizing the most important tests, and ideally those tests are the tests that have not already been done before to the left of us. So we want to make sure that we're capturing all of the testing efforts, and that we have insight into what each of our teammates or disciplines within our Agile team are doing as part of their own quality checks, either individually or that is expected from their own team. And we want to make sure that we're accounting for that, so that we don't emphasize that as part of our first round of testing. All right, so let's move into how do we fix them. So the ceremonies. I don't know how many of you have done these, but I think that a project kickoff is one of the most important meetings that the team can have. And here we've done a lot of really good work. Number one, most companies, at least that I've been to, don't really have a project kickoff, and if they do, it's a lot of times not consistent. You're not getting the same information across teams, and it's really left up to maybe one or two people to set the agenda for a kickoff. So there's not a lot of consistency or a framework in which to use for those kickoffs. One thing that we've done very successfully is that we've implemented what we call the definition of done for each discipline. And so in our case, when I say discipline, you can kind of say that's a pillar, as Bob Galen, some others, and industry thought leaders within Agile would say, or the three amigos, or really it's the discipline or the teams that are make up your Agile team. So typically it's, as I mentioned before, a product manager or a product owner, somebody that's representing product or the business from some standpoint. You have testers in QA or QE, you have developers, and you have UX, and you have Scrum Masters. So if you kind of look across there, those are the 4 or 5 pillars that generally make up project teams. You may have a different makeup of project teams, but the idea is that for each discipline that makes up your Agile project team, and certainly the project that you are getting ready to kick off, you want to understand what are they using as the definition of done. So if you use a tool such as Jira or Rally or some other tool where work flows from left to right, and work moves into a column, and that indicates the activities that are either happening or need to happen on that story. As you kind of look through that board and move cards or stories from the left to the right, we want to make sure that it is very clear and not ambiguous. It's extremely direct and clear, so that when a card moves from, say, dev doing or in progress or something to dev complete or ready for test, that you're not left guessing as to what that means. And so what we did a couple of years ago is we implemented each of the practices, and we worked with the leads or the managers or directors of each of those practices for them to put together their own deck of what the definition of done means. And so that leaves zero or very little ambiguity, so that when that card moves from dev done to ready for test, we don't have to ask whether or not there was unit testing done, or whether there was a code review, or that acceptance criteria was demoed internally, or whatever the other factors are in there, because the dev team has has presented what it means for them to be dev done, or they're dev done for their discipline. And so each of the disciplines have their own deck, and say, okay, so when test is done and we say, okay, we're done, we're ready to test, or we're ready to deliver this, or we're complete with our testing, we don't leave it up for ambiguity, because we have an easily accessible and referenceable document that says, whenever we move a card from this column to this column, here are all the things that we're doing as part of our own internal discipline and individual checks. And I have an example for any of you who may want to see that. I have a deck that I've created and have kind of fine-tuned for the last couple of companies that I've been. It's of course focused on the QA or QE piece, but I'd be happy to share that with anyone that might want to see what those definition of done PowerPoints or slide decks look like. And those, once they're created, other than some initial fine-tuning and review afterwards, that is, once they're created, that basically consistently follows each and every project. And for those of you who may be managers or leaders or directors within a QA or QA organization, these are really good playbooks to use, so that, again, even individuals aren't left up to trying to figure out what their responsibility is. They have a really handy playbook that says, here's what QA or QE's definition of done means. So before you move that card from this column to the done column, here are all the things that you need to be doing or considering in order to make sure that that is actually done. So we move into planning. If you haven't already, trim that invite list. There should be no surprises in planning, right? And so when I say, an hour to an hour and a half, that's pretty good. And I've actually seen planning meetings that have gotten to the point where we've refined everything so well that planning has truly simply become a formality, where everyone nods and verbally or in some other way commits to the work, because they understand everything that is associated with that work. Again, known there, right? We're always going to have some unknowns that happen once we actually start the work, but the doing a little bit of the legwork beforehand allows us to really get into planning, so that it's really more of a formality with no surprises. I still see and hear lots of teams that say when they get into a planning meeting, they are sometimes feverishly trying to complete refinement or grooming or even sizing of that work. If you are into the situation where planning is not set and you can't look up on that projector or on that screen and say, yes, all this work is very familiar to me, I know exactly what was been discussed, then you're probably not ready to plan, and you're certainly not ready to commit to that work. So we want to make sure that the outcome of the planning meeting is really being adhered to. So if you can't trim that invite list, make sure that any stakeholders or people who aren't individual contributors on the team limit their communication, or give them a forum before or after to ask those questions, so that we really get to the point where that planning meeting is extremely efficient and productive. And remember, the outcome of planning is to make sure that we're closing the previous sprint. Even if it's not actually complete, we want to avoid that, well, it's only going to take me a couple of hours, let's keep the sprint open another couple hours or a day or two so that I complete this work. The idea is that we're not planning the next sprint and committing to the next work until we close the previous sprint, because we have to actually account for the work that wasn't completed in the sprint before, and see if we actually need to increase or remove other work that we had originally been looking to commit to, and take into account anything that wasn't completed the sprint before. And a lot of times we can combine the retro. I don't know if you have different retro respective meetings, but and because we've gotten to the point where our planning meetings have been so efficient, we can actually combine the retro, close the previous sprint, and confirm the commitment of the next sprint, all within about 60 to 90 minutes every 2 weeks, or again, whatever the frequency of your sprints are. The refinement and grooming. So talked a little bit about this, right? I'm off for meeting. I tend to say for refinement and grooming, shorter and smaller working sessions with a more tiered refinement outcome is always best, because you're very rarely going to have all of your questions answered in 1 hour-long meeting with 15 of your other, close personal colleagues. Working sessions where a dev, a tester, and the product manager are actually working in a session and vetting out and asking those questions is much more valuable than having a huge meeting like that. And here kind of the outcomes in here, and basically, as I mentioned before, the outcome of a refinement and grooming should be that everyone that has responsibility on that story has everything that they need to start work. And that work could be that that they could start coding, or that we could be writing scripts or tests against those stories. But if it's not considered refined or groomed, or it shouldn't be considered refined or groomed until everyone that has responsibility can nod and agree that they have what they need to start their work. And that's one thing that we tend to not emphasize. We tend to, again, maybe defer to product or to dev in these situations where they are saying, yep, I understand what I need to do. And sometimes test or QA is kind of left out in the dust, and we then have to feverishly try and ask questions afterwards in order to keep the meeting on time. But to in lieu of those larger refinement and grooming meetings, I'm a big fan of smaller working sessions, so that dev, QA, and product and design are working together with that outcome of everyone that has responsibility, has what they need, and they can begin work. And if we can't get to that point, then that work should not be considered refined. And if something is not considered refined, it shouldn't even be considered ready to be planned or committed to for the next sprint. Demos. So one thing that we did in here, and as talking about avoiding the one and done effect, is that we actually, part of the definition of done exercise that we had all of our disciplines do, is that as part of the checks from dev, and before they check in that code and say that it's done and ready for test, they actually do the demo to both QE and PO as part of their own internal quality checks. As part of the code review or unit tests, they wind up demoing the acceptance criteria of that story right then and there, and way left versus waiting until the product owner sees it for the very first time at that demo that at the end of the sprint. So if you have the ability, this is something that was a game changer for us, because we were finding that a developer may have said, yep, the story's ready to go, and starts testing it, and all of a sudden we see that a couple of the acceptance criteria in that story has failed. So this avoids some of those. And then of course what winds up happening is that whole story gets kicked back. And so we've wasted lots of time starting testing and then stopping and then quickly turning it back. By pushing those demos back so that dev can feasibly and reasonably show that the acceptance criteria is met with their code, that has been a game changer. We've saved probably 20 to 25% of time and decreased the number of severity 1 bugs because of that. So if that's something that you have the ability to do, I would strongly encourage those demos happening real time from dev to PO and QE versus at the very end of the sprint. And then we start talking about stand-ups, right? And so in addition to the big 3, and I'm not saying that those big 3 questions aren't valuable, but I like to do an 8-10 sprint, which means that out of a 10-day sprint, we really focus on work is going to be happening about 8 out of those 10 days. And so a successful planning, a successful sprint looks like to us is that the first 2 days of the sprint are spent with dev coding and QE writing tests in conjunction with dev. By the sprint day 3, we should have received at least 1 or more stories from each of the developers to test. And then we are continuing to test each day all of the work that's coming through. And that kind of goes back to my little rule of thumb, where anything more than 2 days between dev and QE is going to innately introduce inefficiencies. So when we track the health of the sprint, the very first thing that we introduce during our stand-up on sprint day 3 is have we gotten at least one story from dev to test that we can start? And if we haven't, then we know that we may be at risk of being unhealthy in the sprint already, and that our commitment of the 10-day sprint may be in jeopardy because we're already not adhering to the schedules. And that's when we start fleshing out whether or not maybe perhaps the estimates were inaccurate, and we discuss why those were, and we change those estimates on the fly given the information that's coming through, or we actually have that conversation. So in a typical day 3 of a sprint, in addition to answering those big 3 questions, we actually look at the status of the sprint and we make sure that there are stories in there. And if there aren't stories in there, we continue, or we have a 16th minute or parking lot session or whatever you want to call that, that actually is addressing some of that could be an apparent unhealthy sprint in there. And then of course the last 2 days of the sprint are spent either swarming the rest of the testing that needs to be done or getting it to the point where that sprint could be shippable. And that's when we come into the point where we're talking about shippable. Shippable means that we could hand this off, we could deliver, we could release, deploy this to production or live or to users at the end of the sprint. Not necessarily that we will, but that the state of the code is there enough and stable enough that we could deliver it if we needed to. And then of course we kind of go through, that shippable. This slide really talks a little bit about, the ABC rule, always be coupled with dev, right? And again, that kind of goes back. If there's more than 2 days, it's going to be very inefficient for dev to start troubleshooting bugs and defects of code that they've written more than 2 days ago. So we want to really be as coupled with dev as possible, always focusing on shippable versus dev done. And then, kind of being the martyr, right? We want to make sure that because we use the definition of done, and because dev is saying, or design or product is saying, these are the things that we do as our own quality checks, we hold our team to those. And we make sure that we are not stepping in and taking responsibility for something that was already the responsibility of someone else on our team. So we want to be that musketeer, all for one and one for all. If the sprint fails, the team fails in a lot of ways. And so success and failure is not necessarily one person, it's the team. And so we want to build that collaboration and culture of stepping in and helping our comrades, but not necessarily taking on too much responsibility. So the duplicating testing efforts, right? So we talked a little bit about this, right? But if we have an easy to follow and use and central information of what dev is doing on their end or what others are doing on their end to test, we can focus on the testing that hasn't already been done. And so that really has a lot to do with conversation, but more importantly, understanding and centralizing all the quality and individual checks that the team is doing to the left of us. All right, so just to kind of end, and I know we've got a couple minutes left here. What we did, so by practicing these and looking specifically at these micro inefficiencies and then fine tuning our SDLC specifically around the ceremonies in here, what we were able to do is we were able to have a cost savings of around 23%, which is pretty significant. And with that 23% cost savings, and this is over the life of a quarter of multiple sprints and releases, we were actually able to build in 3 practices that were either not very well mature or that didn't exist at all. So we were able to focus on 3 areas that the functional or testing team didn't have a lot of insight into, focusing on accessibility, performance, and security. And if you've ever heard me talk on anything else, these are the 3 areas that I feel that from a testing standpoint, we should be paying a lot of attention to. And so we focused that 23% of cost savings into these 3 areas. And we were able to see not only cost savings, but we were actually able to better put in these checks around accessibility, performance, and security and have a much better user experience because of it. So summary, we talked about the inefficiencies and poor outcomes or incorrect outcomes and how to fix them. So I'll leave you. We'll take some questions, and here's my contact information, especially if you're interested in seeing what the definition of done from a QA organization looks like. So with that said, I will open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for the insightful session on Agile SDLC and its implementations and efficiencies and how to make them work for us. We do have questions, so let me just quickly go through a couple of them if they are still coming in. So if there are more coming in, we'll probably take just a few right now and then take the rest of them, probably send them to you, and you could respond them with answers to us, and we can publish them.
You bet.
Yep. So the first one here is, do you find that your non-testing teams like this process as opposed to what they have always done? Or is there a pushback to keep doing things the way they always have?
So I'd say initially there was pushback, right? Because essentially what we're asking them to do is to say, okay, let's take an inventory of all the things that you do or should be doing on your own: UX, product management, development. And we're asking them to centralize that and create a document, and in some cases present that document to the team. So initially there was pushback. So what we did is we did it from a QE standpoint first, and I happened to be, leading the QE team at that point. And so it was much easier for me to start that out on my team. And so when we initially presented it at the first round of kickoffs that were happening, we were met with a little bit with a little bit of pushback. But once we saw the immediate efficiency gains, every single team jumped on board, and it became just a natural progression. So that became a checklist item in the agenda of our kickoffs, and in some cases, in other meetings as well, where we would always then go back and refer. So initially there was some pushback and resistance, but after we saw the immediate efficiency gains, all of the other disciplines jumped on board.
Thanks, Melissa. The next one is, how do you see the inefficiencies in production support project?
In production support projects, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. Is there maybe some clarification on what a production support project means?
Okay. Typically, I don't want to assume for Satish, but we'll wait if he sends in the details. But I would think it was typically the maintenance and enhancement kind of team, like if there is a critical error coming in, and then they kind of fix that and put that back into production.
Yeah, so that may be, you may need to look at then some of the definition of done and scale that down a little bit. The definitions of done and the efficiencies. This is, for projects that are kind of operating on a 2+ week sprint cadence. So if that's not the cycle for these production support or maintenance types of projects, I think that there's absolutely some areas. The exercise and kind of what was in my bio is the GCD approach, which is understanding what is consistent across teams, regardless of what type of project or team you're working on, whether it's maintenance or new product development or something in between. There are always ways for you to identify inefficiencies. These happen to be the inefficiencies that I see across agile project teams, and then across enterprises and companies that I've spoken with over the years. I would just encourage you to kind of take the same approach that we've taken to identify in a more traditional agile project SDLC, and see if any of those can apply, or at least the exercise of identifying those, how they can apply to your projects, your maintenance or production support projects.
Mm-hmm. All right, and if we'll send you the comments on this, and you could probably respond in more detail if needed by Satish. Okay, the under one is, what are the most effective or unusual ways to fight injections? I believe on one of your slides you mentioned injection as like when someone from management adds to or changes a sprint with urgent requests.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I probably skipped over that a little bit. So one thing that we also kind of fine-tuned our stand-ups, in addition to answering the 3 questions, we also ask them to say, has anything been injected? Has anyone come to you? Are you working? Or so there's two ways you can say that. Has there been any injection that has happened in the last 24 business hours? And if so, let's talk about them. The other way is, you can simply ask the question or have them answer the question, have you worked on anything outside of what is on this board that's associated, that may have taken you away from committing or completing your work on this board? Those are two ways that we just kind of centralize it in the stand-up. And so again, we use the stand-ups for relevant topics that are that are happening during that day or during that sprint. So by asking or having the teams individually answer whether or not they have been injected or they're working on something outside of what's on the board will ultimately bubble that up. And so we may say, oh, well, then we should add that story to this board because it's relevant to completing this work, or we need to account for the work that VP or that CTO has asked you to do that's outside of this project work and see if it's actually going to impact our commitment. And then we let the Scrum Master help us, kind of work a little bit more efficiently with that. But those have been the two questions or the two things that we use within our stand-ups. But the important thing is that we use the stand-up to really kind of vet out real life, real time activities that are happening during that day.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm just going to take one last question because we are really running out of time. And so here is the last one, which says, how did you determine or track your cost savings and versus like time saved? Cost savings or time saved, yeah.
So we actually went through and we divided up our work into kind of three main components of what we were going to be doing during that time. And so it could have been either test preparation or planning, test execution, or other reporting that happens within that project. And so as we were waiting for builds, or as we were going back and forth or kicking back stories, we would actually note that, and we would see how much time we were spending within a sprint outside of within our 60 to 80 hours of sprint work, how much of that time was being spent not on test execution, test planning, or other reporting or other project specific activities. And when we saw that, it was typically about 40% of our time was being spent outside of sprint work because we were waiting for things. So in that case, what we did is we wound up calculating that time, and then we put in these efficiencies within our SDLC. And over the course of 3 months after that, we saw the decrease in time because we focused very concentrated on those efficiencies within there. So that's how we calculated that 23% of costs and time savings.
So thank you so much, Melissa. I am sure attendees found it very informative and useful too. So thanks again, and I hope to see you in Virginia.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Well, everyone, this concludes our webinar for today. Thanks for joining, and more importantly, thanks for being so engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and the whole group. If you want to see more such sessions from speakers like Melissa and others and wish to learn more about Agile-related subjects, please come over to STPCon Fall 2018. Stay tuned for more webinars and online trainings coming soon at SoftwareTestPro.com. And if you haven't signed up yet for the upcoming webinars, which is Connecting Manual Testers to the DevOps Era by Dror Todres on 27th June, the link is up for registration, so please go ahead. All right, thank you everyone. Have a great week ahead. See you all in Virginia in October 2018. Happy learning to all of us. Bye-bye.